This documentary is for educational and historical purposes only. Some details are based on accounts, street-level sources, and investigative reporting, not all of which could be independently verified. No glorification of criminal activity is intended.
Welcome to The Last Unsolved. In 1989, Chicago's gang crime unit parked two unmarked cruisers a quarter mile from a known drug market on the west side. They had an informant, they had surveillance, they had a map of every runner on that block. Then, at 2 a.m., a payphone rang somewhere on Pulaski Avenue. Nobody answered it. Within 6 minutes, the entire market had gone dark, workers off the street, product gone. Corners empty, no shots fired, no sirens, no radio communication the unit could intercept. By the time investigators logged what happened, the operation had reportedly resumed 3 blocks away. They never figured out how. Chicago's West Side in the late 1980s was not simply a poor neighborhood. It was a community that had been systematically stripped of its economic foundation over the course of 2 decades and largely left to absorb the consequences alone. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the West Side had sustained a working economy. Manufacturing plants, metalwork facilities, and light industrial employers provided stable, union-backed wages to working-class black families in neighborhoods like Lawndale, Garfield Park, and the stretch of blocks collectively known as K-Town, named for the letter that started nearly every street: Komensky, Karlov, Keeler, Kostner, Kilbourne. Then, one by one, the employers left. Maytag, International Harvester, plant after plant either relocated to suburban corridors or shut Midwest operations entirely. According to urban policy researchers who have studied the period, the West Side lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs between 1970 and 1985. What followed was not just unemployment. It was the collapse of an economic identity that entire communities had organized their lives around for generations. The city's response, documented in public budget records from the period, was a sustained reduction in municipal investment across West Side neighborhoods, cuts to community programming, youth services, school budgets, and basic infrastructure maintenance. The physical deterioration was visible and measurable. Streets with broken lighting that went unrepaired for years, transit routes that left residents without reliable connections to employment centers outside their immediate area, neighborhood commercial strips that had hollowed out to a handful of liquor stores and currency exchanges. The grocery stores left, the bank branches closed, the youth centers shut their doors. When documented economic pathways, close employment, banking access, commercial investment, what researchers describe as informal economies tend to expand to fill the vacuum. On Chicago's West Side, that expansion took a specific organizational form that would come to define the neighborhood for the better part of a decade. The Black Souls were not, according to accounts from that period, a typical street gang in the way that term is commonly understood. Larger factions operating across Chicago, the Vice Lords, the Gangster Disciples, were engaged in highly visible, frequently violent territorial conflicts that generated consistent media coverage and drew sustained law enforcement attention. They reportedly held broad geographic areas through a combination of numbers and public force projection. Their names appeared in police reports constantly. The Black Souls, by most accounts, operated on a fundamentally different model. Sources familiar with the organization's structure from that period describe an operation built around a deliberate low-visibility philosophy. Public confrontation was reportedly discouraged at the organizational level, not for ethical reasons, but for operational ones. Every incident of street violence brought increased patrol density, news cameras, and federal task force attention. Each of those outcomes disrupted revenue, The organization's leadership, according to former law enforcement officials who worked the West Side during that period, appeared to have made a calculated assessment. Disorder was bad for. Bottom line, in practice, this reportedly produced a structured, tiered operation concentrated on specific blocks across the West Side. Lookouts worked outer perimeters, using coded signals to communicate police movement well before patrol units reached the market. Runners handled product transfers in ways designed to limit any single individual's legal exposure. Financial processing moved through interior locations, away from the street-level activity that uniformed officers could observe directly. Each layer of the structure reportedly knew only what it needed to know to perform its function. The hierarchy was strict. Internal discipline, according to accounts from former investigators, was enforced consistently enough that the organization maintained an unusual level of operational security for a street-level enterprise. Cooperative witnesses, the backbone of most successful drug prosecutions, were reportedly difficult for law enforcement to develop within the organization's core structure. Near the top of that structure on the West Side, according to the available accounts, sat a figure known as Willie T. Public records and investigative accounts from this period offer limited documentation of Willie T's personal biography. What exists is drawn primarily from law enforcement reporting, grand jury proceedings, and community accounts that researchers have collected in the years since. What those sources describe is a figure who reportedly ran his sector not through direct street presence, but through a management structure operating through a vetted inner circle while maintaining enough distance from day-to-day transactions to limit his direct legal exposure. This approach, according to former investigators, was deliberate and consistent over time. The organizational security around him was, by law enforcement accounts, unusually rigorous. Individuals suspected of cooperating with police reportedly faced swift internal consequences. The organization's apparent ability to identify potential informants before law enforcement could fully develop them was a recurring problem for investigators attempting to build cases from inside the network. Willie T's personal operational posture reflected the same discipline. He reportedly varied his locations, rotated vehicles, and kept his immediate circle extremely small. Communication reportedly moved through methods, payphones, coded pagers, rotating meeting points that were difficult for surveillance units to monitor consistently over extended periods. Former investigators who worked West Side cases during the late 1980s and early 1990s have described the experience of targeting the Black Soul's upper leadership as methodically frustrating. The organization did not make the kinds of mistakes that typically gave investigators leverage: visible transactions, sloppy communications, loose associations with unknown contacts. The gaps in the evidentiary record that prosecutors needed to fill kept staying open. What made Willie T notable by those accounts was not simply the duration of his avoidance of prosecution. It was the apparent deliberateness of how he operated, a composure that sources describe as calculated rather than lucky, structured rather than instinctive. There is one image from this period that researchers and documentarians have returned to consistently: Willie T on a West Side block wearing a heavy, custom gold piece bearing his street name. On its surface, it appears to contradict everything else documented about his approach: the careful management of exposure, the rotation of locations, the deliberate distance from visible street activity. People who were present in that environment offer different interpretations. From a law enforcement perspective, visible personal identifiers were exactly the kind of detail that surveillance units logged and used to build identification records. In an environment where senior figures were being photographed by both undercover units and rivals, wearing your name publicly created risk that most figures at that level worked to avoid. From the perspective of people familiar with the West Side's social dynamics during that period, the display reportedly communicated something more specific to the audiences that mattered most. In a street economy where leaders were being removed regularly through federal indictments, rival violence, or informant-driven prosecutions, a figure who appeared publicly without apparent anxiety was projecting something about the structural security of his position. Whether that projection was accurate was almost secondary to the effect it produced. The crack cocaine economy had, by the late 1980s, produced cash flows in urban street markets that had no real historical precedent at the street level. According to DA reporting from the period, established West Side markets were generating figures that transformed the material circumstances of the people running them in visible and rapid ways. Custom jewelry, significant, personalized, and immediately legible as a status marker, was a common way that cash was converted into visible social currency across these networks. What distinguished Willie T's gold piece, according to accounts, was less its size than its specificity. His name, not a generic symbol, his identity, not an organizational insignia. Sources suggest it was understood by people in that environment as a personal statement of permanence, a declaration that he did not expect to be removed. The standard prosecutorial and media narrative around figures like Willie T was, in its broad strokes, consistent. Criminal operators running drug markets that destabilized vulnerable communities and profited from addiction and violence. That narrative was accurate in its essential facts. The drug economy the Black Souls ran produced addiction across the same neighborhoods where the organization operated. Families were broken apart by both the product being distributed and the violence that periodically accompanied the business of distributing it. The harm was real, documented, and in many cases, permanent. What that narrative consistently left out, according to researchers who have studied the period and residents who lived through it, was the specific context in which these organizations operated and why they maintained the levels of community insulation they did. During the years of sharpest municipal disinvestment, roughly the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, street organizations reportedly filled certain service gaps that formal institutions had vacated. Community accounts from that period describe organizations funding neighborhood events, providing informal financial support to elderly residents, and enforcing a street code that prohibited certain forms of predatory crime within their territory. Robberies of local businesses, according to multiple accounts, were reportedly dealt with through the organization's own enforcement, rather than through police channels that community members often described as unreliable. Police response times in West Side neighborhoods during this period are documented in city records as among the slowest in Chicago. Residents who experienced this firsthand were not making abstract political calculations when they declined to cooperate with investigators. They were making practical assessments about which institutions had actually been present in their lives and which had not. This is not a justification for what the Black Souls ran. The damage done by the drug economy they sustained fell disproportionately on the people around them. But investigators who spent years trying to develop cooperative witnesses in these neighborhoods have described in retrospect an environment where the usual assumptions about community cooperation with law enforcement simply did not apply, and where understanding why requires looking honestly at what the alternative institutional landscape actually looked like. By the early 1990s, the relative organizational stability of the West Side's drug market had begun to fracture. The cash flows generated by the crack economy had drawn newer, less disciplined crews looking to establish footholds in territory that more structured organizations had developed over years. According to accounts from people familiar with West Side dynamics in that period, these crews operated with less regard for the low visibility principles that had characterized Black Soul's operations. They were more willing to use overt force and less focused on the kind of organizational discipline that kept federal attention at a distance. This created a specific kind of pressure on established operations: respond visibly and attract law enforcement, or absorb challenges in ways that might be read as weakness. One incident from this period is described consistently enough across separate accounts to be worth examining, though it cannot be verified from any public court record. According to those accounts, a rival crew reportedly attempted to establish an unsanctioned operation on a block within Black Soul's territory. The conventional response, consistent with how most Chicago street organizations handled territorial challenges in that period, would have been a direct physical confrontation, visible, fast, and designed to make the consequences of the challenge immediately clear. No such confrontation was documented. Instead, within roughly 24 hours, the rival operation had reportedly lost access to its product supply at multiple points. The workers stopped appearing. The market closed without a recorded incident of violence connected to the conflict. How this was accomplished is not in any public record. Former law enforcement officials asked about the general capability of Black Soul's operations in this period have described an organization with enough supply chain relationships and enough operational reach to move quickly against a competitor's logistics without necessarily resorting to physical confrontation as the primary tool. What the incident produced, according to accounts from that period, was a specific kind of reputation, one that generated uncertainty among potential rivals about what a challenge would actually cost them and how it would be answered. That uncertainty, sources suggest, was itself a form of deterrence that reduced the frequency of direct challenges over time. No street-level organization of this scale, operating in this period, proved sustainable against a coordinated federal investigation with sufficient time and resources. By the mid-1990s, federal authorities working across the FBI, ATF, and IRS Criminal Investigation Division had shifted their approach to Chicago's urban drug enforcement in specific ways. The blunt force raid strategy that had characterized earlier decades of drug enforcement disrupted operations temporarily but rarely reached organizational leadership in ways that produced lasting structural damage. Federal prosecutors had learned from cases around the country that dismantling these organizations required a different approach. What emerged, documented in federal case records from Chicago during this period, was a methodology built on extended timelines, wiretap authorizations renewed over months or years, financial forensic investigation that traced cash movements through layers of legitimate business fronts, and the patient cultivation of cooperative witnesses developed not through a single arrest, but through sustained legal pressure over extended periods. Grand jury proceedings in the Northern District of Illinois ran quietly through this period, accumulating testimony and documentary evidence while the organizations being targeted continued operating under the assumption that no case was being built. According to accounts from people familiar with the Black Soul's response to increasing federal pressure, Willie T attempted to adapt by moving operations further from observable street corners and into more distributed networks, meeting points, and supply chain connections that changed frequently and were communicated only through a small number of trusted intermediaries. Former investigators described this period as a particular kind of procedural frustration. Surveillance infrastructure established over months would find its targets had relocated. The operation would continue, harder to map, in different locations. The case would have to catch up. But the federal RICO statute was designed precisely for this kind of organizational persistence. It reaches patterns of activity and organizational structure, not just individual transactions. And the evidence accumulating across wiretaps, financial records, and grand jury testimony was, according to the case record, building toward a threshold that the organization's adaptations could delay but not ultimately prevent. The indictments, when they came, moved through the leadership structure in ways that the organization could not fully absorb. There was no single raid that ended it, no climactic moment. What the federal prosecution of West Side organizations through the 1990s produced was a slow, documented dismantling, key figures removed through indictment and prosecution, operational network disrupted through the loss of people who had held them together, the organizational coherence that had made the Black Souls distinctive during their peak period gradually eroded by sustained institutional pressure. Willie T's specific legal outcomes are not fully documented in publicly available records in the way that higher-profile cases have been. The accounts agree that the period of organizational cohesion he was associated with did not survive the decade intact. What did survive was a reputation more durable, it turned out, than the organization itself. Among people who lived on the West Side during those years, the Black Souls' operational approach from the late 1980s is still referenced as a specific historical marker, not as a model to be admired, but as a point of reference for a particular kind of organizational discipline that existed for a particular period in a particular place. Among law enforcement officials who worked Chicago during the 1990s, the organization is referenced similarly as an example of how street-level operations could develop a structural sophistication that required federal resources and multi-year investigations to address. Several former investigators have described it, in retrospect, as among the more methodically challenging cases of that period. The archival photographs from those years, Willie T on the West Side, the gold piece visible, the circle of associates around him, have moved through digital platforms in the years since. Surfacing in true crime research, Chicago history documentation, and hip-hop culture references to the city's 1980s underground economy. They are artifacts, physical evidence of a specific moment in a specific place, when a set of specific conditions, municipal abandonment, a drug economy generating unprecedented cash, organized networks filling the vacuum, intersected in ways that produced something that could not be fully understood in real time, and that the historical record has only partially reconstructed since the full scope of what Willie T operated on Chicago's West Side, its precise structure, its actual revenues, the complete account of its human consequences, was never established in any single public proceeding. Federal investigations documented portions, community accounts filled in others, court records captured what prosecutors needed for their cases. The rest remained in the gaps. What is documented is the damage, the addiction the drug economy produced, the incarceration it generated, the families that did not survive the period intact. That harm is in the record in ways that are not disputed. The questions the period raises about what happens to communities when formal institutions withdraw, about who moves into that space and at what cost, and about how the people involved are prosecuted, remembered, and understood, those questions remain genuinely unresolved. The West Side moved on. The organizations restructured, the specific networks from that period are gone, the case never fully closed. It only went quiet, and the last unsolved.